These weren't supposed to fail. What happens when Hollywood pours millions into a film, and audiences simply don't show up? In 1985, studios gambled big, chasing spectacle, star power, and blockbuster formulas. But behind the posters and premieres, something went very wrong. Massive budgets collapsed. Careers stalled. Entire strategies unraveled. In this video, we're uncovering 13 films that didn't just disappoint. They became financial disasters, and one of them nearly changed the future of a major studio forever. The Legend of Billie Jean, 1985. It looked like a youth rebellion story built for instant connection. A young girl pushed too far, a town that refuses to listen, a message that feels explosive, but audiences didn't respond the way the studio expected. And The Legend of Billie Jean arrived with a clear identity, teen angst, social injustice, and a rebellious spirit that echoed the cultural mood of the mid-'80s. Yet something didn't translate. The tone felt uneven, shifting between grounded drama and stylized fantasy in ways that confused viewers. Marketing struggled to define it. Was it a serious social film or a pop-driven teen fantasy? That uncertainty hurt its box office performance. Despite strong performances and a message that would later resonate, the film quietly faded during its theatrical run. It wasn't rejected outright. It was simply overlooked. Only years later did it find life as a cult favorite. But in 1985, it was another example of Hollywood misreading its own audience. Silverado, 1985. On paper, Silverado had everything. A respected director, a powerful cast, a genre deeply rooted in Hollywood history. But by 1985, the Western was no longer a guaranteed success. The film aimed to revive the classic frontier spirit. Gunfights, lawmen, outlaws, and moral battles stretched across dusty landscapes. It was crafted with care, filled with energy, and backed by a significant budget. The problem wasn't quality, it was timing. Audiences had moved on. The Western, once the backbone of American cinema, had slowly lost its grip on mainstream popularity. Younger viewers were turning toward sci-fi, action, and modern thrillers. Silverado arrived like a film from another era. Technically impressive, but culturally out of sync. Despite solid reviews and strong performances, the box office returns couldn't justify its cost. It didn't collapse dramatically. It simply couldn't keep up. A reminder that even well-made films can fail when they belong to a genre audiences have already left behind. Fletch, 1985. Chevy Chase was expected to deliver another hit. That expectation alone made Fletch a high-stakes gamble. The film followed an undercover journalist navigating a strange web of deception, disguises, and sharp humor. It had all the ingredients of a commercial success: comedy, mystery, and a charismatic lead known for his timing. But something didn't fully connect. The humor, while clever, felt inconsistent to general audiences. The story leaned into subtlety at times, then shifted into exaggerated comedy without warning. That tonal imbalance made it harder for viewers to settle into the experience. Marketing also leaned heavily on Chase's persona. And when audiences showed up expecting a certain type of comedy, what they received felt slightly different. The result was a performance that fell below expectations. Not a complete failure, but not the hit the studio needed. Over time, Fletch would build a loyal following, with many appreciating its offbeat charm and layered humor. But during its initial release, it became another example of a film that couldn't meet the weight of its own expectations. In 1985, that gap between promise and reality was enough to label it a disappointment. Ladyhawke, 1985. It had romance. It had fantasy. It had a story built around a curse that separated two lovers by time itself. But Ladyhawke struggled to turn that concept into box office success. As the film attempted to blend medieval fantasy with emotional storytelling, following two characters bound by a tragic fate, one human by day, the other by night. It was visually ambitious, with sweeping landscapes and a strong central idea. Yet audiences felt something was off. Part of the issue was tone. The film moved between epic romance and light adventure, never fully committing to either. That inconsistency made it difficult to emotionally anchor the audience. The atmosphere felt uneven, serious in one moment, strangely distant in the next. Another unexpected factor was its modern-sounding musical score. Instead of reinforcing the medieval setting, it created a disconnect that many viewers found distracting. Despite strong performances and a memorable premise, Ladyhawke couldn't build the momentum it needed. And it didn't fail because it lacked ambition. It failed because its vision never fully aligned. In 1985, that was enough for audiences to quietly walk away. To Live and Die in L.A., 1985. This wasn't a safe film, and that may have been the problem. To Live and Die in L.A. delivered a dark, unpredictable crime story that refused to follow traditional rules. It centered on obsession, moral collapse, and the dangerous line between law enforcement and criminal behavior. Unlike typical thrillers of the time, it didn't offer comfort. It offered tension. The film's gritty tone, combined with its willingness to take narrative risks, made it stand out, but not in a way that guaranteed mass appeal. Audiences expecting a conventional crime story were met with something far more unsettling. And characters made questionable choices. The story avoided clear heroes, and the ending didn't deliver the kind of resolution many viewers were used to. Critics would later recognize its boldness. But at the time, that boldness worked against it. It also faced stiff competition from more accessible films that dominated theaters. In a marketplace driven by clear entertainment value, ambiguity became a liability. The film didn't fail because it was weak. It failed because it was ahead of what audiences were ready to accept. And in 1985, that distinction made all the difference. Jagged Edge, 1985. At first glance, Jagged Edge seemed like a safe bet. A courtroom thriller, a murder case, a story built on tension, suspicion, and psychological manipulation. These were elements audiences had embraced before. But this time, something didn't click. The film centered on a defense attorney representing a man accused of a brutal crime. As the case unfolds, doubt begins to creep in, not just for the characters, but for the audience itself. Is he innocent or dangerously deceptive? It's a strong premise, yet the execution created distance. The pacing moved slower than expected for a thriller, allowing tension to build gradually, but not always effectively. Some viewers found the story engaging, while others felt it lacked the urgency needed to keep them fully invested. The marketing promised intensity. The film delivered something more restrained. That mismatch affected its performance. While it did generate moderate interest, the returns weren't strong enough to justify its production and promotional costs. It didn't collapse instantly, but it never gained the momentum needed to become a true success. In a year filled with louder, more visually driven films, Jagged Edge struggled to stand out. It became another reminder that even familiar formulas can fail if they don't fully connect with audience expectations. The Black Cauldron, 1985. This was supposed to be Disney's bold new direction. Instead, it became one of the studio's most troubling moments. The Black Cauldron was an ambitious attempt to push animation into darker territory. Inspired by fantasy literature, it introduced a world filled with danger, magic, and genuinely frightening elements. Far removed from the lighter tone audiences associated with Disney, the studio invested heavily. The expectations were enormous, but the response was uncertain. And families weren't sure if it was appropriate for children. Adults weren't convinced it was meant for them. That identity crisis created hesitation, and hesitation hurt ticket sales. Behind the scenes, production had already faced challenges. Creative disagreements, delays, and significant costs had placed pressure on the film long before its release. When it finally reached theaters, it needed to succeed. It didn't. The box office performance fell short, raising serious concerns within Disney about the future of its animation division. For a moment, it wasn't just a failed film. It felt like a warning sign. Years later, Disney would recover and redefine animation. But in 1985, The Black Cauldron stood as a rare and unsettling failure for a studio built on consistency. Year of the Dragon, 1985. And this was meant to be a hard-hitting crime epic. Instead, it became one of the most controversial misfires of the year. Year of the Dragon followed a determined police captain diving into New York's Chinatown underworld. The film leaned heavily into themes of power, corruption, and cultural conflict, presenting a story that was intense, aggressive, and unapologetically harsh. But that approach came at a cost. Almost immediately, the film faced backlash for its portrayal of Asian communities. Critics and advocacy groups accused it of reinforcing stereotypes and creating a one-sided narrative that blurred the line between fiction and harmful representation. That controversy overshadowed everything. Audiences didn't just see a crime story. They saw a film surrounded by tension before they even entered the theater. At the same time, its dark tone made it less accessible to general viewers. It lacked the escapism that audiences often sought in mainstream releases. The result was a film caught between two extremes, too controversial for some, too intense for others. Despite strong performances and a clear directorial vision, the box office returns failed to meet expectations. It wasn't just a financial disappointment. It became a case where controversy directly impacted commercial survival. Revolution, 1985. It had a major star. It had historical scale. And it had the kind of ambition that studios believed could turn into prestige success. But Revolution became one of the most painful miscalculations of the decade. Starring Al Pacino, the film attempted to tell a grounded story set during the American Revolutionary War, focusing not on generals or leaders, but on ordinary people pulled into conflict. It aimed for realism, stripping away heroism and replacing it with struggle, confusion, and survival. That decision was bold, but it didn't resonate. Audiences expected something more traditional: clear characters, emotional clarity, and a narrative that guided them through history. Instead, they were given a slower, heavier pace that felt distant and difficult to connect with. Even Pacino's performance became a point of criticism. His accent and delivery stood out in ways that distracted rather than immersed. Behind the scenes, the production faced delays and rising costs, increasing pressure on the film's success. When it finally reached theaters, it needed strong support. It didn't get it. The box office response was weak, and the film quickly faded from cinemas. The impact went beyond finances. Director Hugh Hudson stepped away from filmmaking for years. Pacino himself would later take a break from acting. Revolution wasn't just a flop. It was a turning point, one that quietly altered careers and exposed the risks of ambitious historical storytelling without audience alignment. Dune, 1985. This was supposed to be the next Star Wars. Instead, it became a warning. Dune arrived with enormous expectations. Based on a complex and beloved science fiction novel, the film promised a vast universe. Politics, prophecy, war, and power spread across distant planets. The scale was undeniable. The problem was clarity. The story was dense, filled with unfamiliar terms, layered mythology, and multiple factions competing for control. For fans of the book, it was an ambitious adaptation. For general audiences, it was overwhelming. Viewers struggled to follow the narrative. Exposition came quickly and often, leaving little time to fully process the world being built. Instead of immersion, many experienced confusion. The film's pacing added to the issue. Moments that required emotional weight moved too quickly, while others lingered without clear payoff. Visually, it was striking. Commercially, it faltered. The high production costs meant the film needed a major return to justify its scale. When audiences didn't respond in large numbers, the gap between investment and revenue became impossible to ignore. It wasn't a quiet disappointment. It was a loud one. Studios took notice. Large-scale sci-fi projects suddenly carried more risk. The idea that spectacle alone could guarantee success began to fade. Years later, Dune would be re-evaluated and appreciated for its ambition. But in 1985, it stood as a costly lesson. Even the biggest visions can fail if audiences can't find their way inside them. Lifeforce, 1985. This film didn't just aim to be different, it aimed to shock. Lifeforce blended science fiction, horror, and surreal imagery into a story that felt unpredictable from the very beginning. It opened with a space mission discovering mysterious humanoid beings inside a drifting spacecraft, an idea that quickly spiraled into something far stranger. When these beings reach Earth, chaos follows. Energy is drained from victims. Bodies collapse. As entire cities begin to fall into panic. The film escalates rapidly, moving from eerie mystery to large-scale destruction in a way that few films attempted at the time. But that ambition came with a problem. It was difficult to categorize. Was it horror? Science fiction? Psychological fantasy? The answer seemed to be all of them. And that confused audiences. Marketing struggled to define the film clearly. Trailers emphasized spectacle, but the actual story unfolded in ways that many viewers didn't expect. The tone shifted constantly, making it hard for audiences to settle into a consistent experience. At the same time, its bold imagery pushed boundaries. For some viewers, it was fascinating. For others, it was simply too strange. With a significant budget behind it, the film needed a wide audience to succeed. Instead, it divided viewers. When the box office returns reflected that division, Lifeforce didn't fail because it lacked originality. It failed because it had too much of it, without a clear path for audiences to follow. In 1985, that kind of risk didn't pay off. Red Sonja, 1985. Hollywood believed it had found a formula. Sword and sorcery adventures were gaining attention. Fantasy worlds filled with warriors, magic, and battles had started to draw audiences looking for spectacle and escape. Red Sonja was designed to capitalize on that momentum. It carried recognizable elements, powerful heroes, ancient kingdoms, and a clear struggle between good and evil. It even connected itself to the popularity of earlier fantasy successes, creating the expectation that audiences would return for more of the same. But something didn't work. The story felt thinner than expected. Characters lacked the depth needed to carry the scale of the world around them. Instead of building emotional investment, the film relied heavily on visual elements and action sequences. That imbalance became clear quickly. Audiences didn't just want spectacle, they wanted connection. At the same time, critics responded harshly. Reviews pointed to weak dialogue, inconsistent pacing, and a narrative that failed to fully engage. Negative word of mouth spread fast. And in a competitive release window, that mattered. The film struggled to maintain audience interest beyond its opening. Financially, the results were disappointing. What was intended to expand a growing fantasy trend instead exposed its limitations. The studios began to realize that not every sword and sorcery story could replicate earlier successes. Red Sonja didn't collapse instantly, but it steadily lost momentum. And by the end of its run, it became clear that the formula wasn't as reliable as Hollywood had believed. King Solomon's Mines, 1985. This was supposed to be the next great adventure franchise, a rival to Indiana Jones, a film that could capture the same sense of discovery, danger, and excitement that audiences had already proven they loved. Instead, it became the year's most telling failure. King Solomon's Mines followed a familiar structure, lost treasure, dangerous landscapes, and a journey filled with obstacles. It had all the recognizable pieces of a successful adventure film, but familiarity wasn't enough. The execution felt forced. Now, rather than creating its own identity, the film leaned heavily into imitation. Scenes echoed the tone and style of more successful adventure films, but without the same level of polish or originality. Audiences noticed. What should have felt exciting instead felt predictable. Action sequences lacked impact, humor didn't always land, and the overall tone struggled to balance adventure with light-hearted moments. The result was a film that felt like a copy rather than a competitor. That perception damaged its appeal quickly. At the box office, it failed to generate the excitement needed to sustain strong returns. Interest dropped, and the film couldn't recover. Financially, it became one of the clearest examples of a studio chasing a trend without fully understanding what made that trend work. But the impact goes deeper. Failures like this don't just affect one film, they influence future decisions. Studios become more cautious, projects are reconsidered, strategies shift. King Solomon's Mines wasn't just a disappointment, it was a signal, a reminder that audiences can recognize authenticity, and that imitation, no matter how well funded, isn't enough to guarantee success. In 1985, that lesson came at a cost. Behind every flop is a decision that looked right, until it wasn't. These films didn't just lose money, they exposed how unpredictable audiences really are. So the next time a blockbuster fails, remember, Hollywood has been here before. And sometimes, the biggest disasters don't come from bad ideas. They come from believing success can be repeated.